OK， 我们现在开始我们的下一场，就是我们Father David Foster 这个演讲他的题目是 The Place of Education in the Tradition of English Benedictines: Historical Perspective and Contemporary Challenges. Father Foster is a professor of philosophy, Greek and Latin at the Pontifical Athenaeum St. Aseimo. So 我们可以欢迎please welcome Father David Foster.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this for me a first experience to try and give a lecture online. I'll try and do so as efficiently as I can. Obviously, the English Benedictines have a tradition which goes back to the beginnings of Benedictine monasticism, and that already gives English Benedictine life its own stamp. I think one must obviously acknowledge that in the rule of St. Benedict, there were children in the monasteries. They were normally oblates, already committed to monastic life, but in need of an education. And also the novitiate formation of young monks would have included education. It's, I think, evident that monks were fully literate when they took their profession, at least normally. However, the story of education as a Benedictine work really goes back to the Carolingian period and to about 800, where the secular governments of what would now be France and Germany, Central Europe, used Benedictine monasteries and encouraged Benedictine monasteries as a kind of instrument for their own, if you like, civilization of Central Europe. And monasteries would have been involved in evangelization, but in order to preach the gospel, had to teach people to read and write. And this story is, I think, fairly well known, but certainly it's from this period on, the High Middle Ages, where Benedictines are fully involved in the secular growth of society and its education. So much so that during the Middle Ages in Britain, for instance, the monasteries all over the country would have had their schools, but they were also involved in the universities of both Oxford and Cambridge in playing their part in developing an integrated vision of Christian society, and one in which the Benedictine monks, were deeply involved in the sort of most up-to-date intellectual developments, for instance, in the growth of nominalism in Oxford University. That was if you like, the Middle Ages. The Reformation marks the big change. In England, at any rate, from 1533 onwards, the suppression of all the monasteries was part of a completely new politics, which had a vision of a lay society under the monarch and parliament, with a high level of conformity expected to the official church, which meant that Catholics, and indeed actually many Protestants, were effectively excluded from society, and certainly Catholic clergy were imprisoned and killed. The Catholic response to this involves the very beginnings of the current English Benedictine congregation, because people continued to enter monastic life from England and Wales, but on the continent. And in doing so, they became ordained as priests if they were monks. They were ordained as priests and returned to serve in secret underground as in the mission to support the Catholic life of the families that survived in England. That was one part of the mission, to go back to England and provide priests and the sacraments in secret. The other part was just as important, and it was the opening of schools on the European mainland, largely in modern Belgium and northern France, where pupils from these Catholic families could go and become educated in a Catholic tradition of education, many of them themselves becoming monks and priests, but that was no longer the principal aim of the school. And that continued from the beginning of the 17th century through the 18th century. And indeed, nearly half the history of my congregation was spent essentially on the continent. As direct persecution of Catholics diminished in England and Wales, especially after the French Revolution in 1789, which forced foreign religious back to England, the missions, the so-called missions to Catholics, began to move out of the sort of families that had protected them and into the towns which by the late 18th century were beginning to undergo the Industrial Revolution and to grow. And together with other religious orders who were principally perhaps involved in education of the ordinary people of these towns, as well as with nursing and other social work, this was a major period of growth, this really strong period for the Catholic Church in England, even though it was still, if you like, against the law to be Catholic. In this context, the Benedictine schools, which were associated with the monasteries, now in England, continued their work of educating the wealthier elite families who were still excluded from English society. And so it was, that was the real picture until 1829. From 1829, this is the period when the British government began to remove the laws penalizing Catholics. After 1829, the Catholics were no longer penalized, and yet they were not easily able to enter the sort of institutional structures of British society because they didn't have a university education. The universities were still closed to Catholics. And so these Benedictine schools, working mainly with the elite families, were trying to educate them up to the level at which they would be able to play a full part in English society and to help sort of integrate the Catholic community as a whole in the changing world, obviously changing very quickly by 1850. And I think one could say that this was completed with a considerable amount of success. Certainly, before, and I'll move on to the 20th century now, before the Second World War, by 1920, I think one could say that the English Benedictines, with their schools, and indeed actually Catholics in English society as a whole, had reached a kind of high point and were deeply involved in the cultural and institutional political life of the United Kingdom. And it's interesting to see how by the 1920s, the English Benedictine monasteries too were at their very biggest. There was a sort of high point in their own sort of growth. And indeed, every Benedictine school in England, every Benedictine monastery in England had its own school. There were, in fact, in England, 8. And in the United States also, there were 3 communities founded in the 20th century, all specifically to run secondary schools. So it was, a really important part of the work of our congregation. And indeed, even in 1970, when a monastery from a different tradition joined the congregation, it was assumed that it would open a school. And indeed it did. So Benedictine life in England was very much associated with education, and including the education of monks and priests for service of the church in England. But you can see how already there's a change. In the Middle Ages, it was part of an integrated vision of society. But by the beginning of the 20th century, although it was very much committed to British society, it was committed to the Catholic vision of that society and the enabling of a full Catholic participation and, if you like, guidance of, influence in the growth of that society. But the world was changing, and after the Second World War, I think we have to, at least this is the way I see it, we have to notice, I think, the signs of a decline, and indeed a process of decline, but also change, which has sort of carried on really to the present day. The problems, I think, with Benedictine schools in England, by the way, at this point one has to recognize that the United States has a different story, and I can't really speak very clearly about that. But in the United Kingdom, and that's basically England, there was one school in Scotland and none in Wales. The basic problem was associated with the Education Reform Act, which was passed in 1944 and was one of the principal instruments for the development in England and Wales of what one would call a welfare society. In other words, education was being provided at the expense of the state through taxation to everybody free of charge. And similarly, there were reforms in university education to secure the same goals. The problem was that this provided a level of education and access to it which had never been available in England before, and it was available to everybody, but it was available very much on government terms. The governments were involved not only in building and funding the schools, but very closely with the curriculum and the process of assessment and granting of degrees. Now, at the primary level of education, where in England and Wales, the English Catholic diocese had already begun establishing primary schools in parishes, the diocesan schools went into the state system and accepted a large measure of state direction. The Benedictine schools, however, and indeed those associated with other religious orders, and they were largely in the secondary sector, i.e. from essentially age 13 upwards. The Benedictine schools, however, remained independent, specifically in order to retain control of the curriculum and of the aims and objectives of the education, the Catholic education that they wished to promote. Britain, obviously, the British government assured schools of the liberty to do so, but at the cost of receiving no funding at all. So the Benedictine schools, at the same time as education was becoming extremely accessible and free of charge, the Benedictine schools became extremely expensive and increasingly hard for ordinary families to access. And this, I think, has created a critical problem in Catholic and British society, that these Benedictine schools have become associated with a highly elite part of the educational provision of our country, and indeed an elite which is scarcely in the outside. The Catholic sector is still fairly populated by British children, but is aimed primarily at European and indeed around the world, pupils from around the whole world, and indeed I might say increasingly from the Chinese world. And one might well wonder how a monastery conceived the mission of this school in the way that it would have done in the past, as part of its own commitment to a local culture and community. There are, as a result, a number of challenges which have reinforced this problem. At a formal level, although there is the freedom to promote this education, Catholic education, in practical terms, the government interferes increasingly by regulation, by the sharpening of its professional expectations on teachers, laws about safety and the provision of facilities for pupils, laws about equality and equality of opportunity. These have created what one calls in England a regulatory environment in which it is increasingly hard to promote what I will carry on to suggest are the deep values of Benedictine education. At the same time, there has been, I think, a sort of undeclared policy to marginalise private education in British society, and in particular, to challenge its extremely elitist and extremely expensive foundations, and in particular to be deeply suspicious of the religious character of schools. This is a problem which affects all religious schools, Jewish, Muslim, and indeed Catholic, and indeed extremely evangelical Protestant schools. More recently, as everyone really must appreciate, safeguarding and issues with sexual abuse have created a particularly difficult crisis. The issues that I think have been addressed in various ways, at considerable pain and difficulty, but the result, the large-scale result, has been to make it practically impossible any longer for monastic communities to retain the direction of their schools. And there has been, one way and another, a movement to move the schools out of the control of monasteries into the direction of independent lay governorship, and to seek to retain the Benedictine influence in less formal ways, and especially through the ministry of chaplaincies or through some sort of spiritual formation which can be provided outside the curriculum. As a result, although we now have still 4 schools in England, 4 Benedictine schools have closed. In the United States, thanks be to God, all 3 schools continue and indeed remain very much central to the mission of those communities as ever. To a great extent, the future of the schools has to depend on other resources than the monasteries, because as you will probably appreciate, the vocational shortage in monasteries is critical, and my own community has had to leave the monastery which it has lived in, where in fact the school continues, to try to find a place and way of living which is actually more realistic for us. So monasteries have been dissociating themselves from schools, but have nevertheless been developing other forms of education through work with adults, through retreats, and in that kind of way. And I think I would also say perhaps, having talked about the challenges, the opportunities I think perhaps lie, especially with the promotion of Benedictine life in new forms. So, especially with groups of lay people working with students, and indeed with schools. There is a lay movement in Chile which is associated with the English community, the Manquehue Apostolic movement, which runs big schools, very on explicitly Benedictine lines. So, the English story is, I think, instructive. I don't think it's not got a happy ending, but it's not yet finished. The story is, I think, instructive, especially in the difficulty which Benedictines will always have trying to match the values by which it lives, which inspire it, with the values of a wider society. And obviously in the contemporary world, these values, I think, are very much in question, and the challenge is really of evangelization again. That is, if you like, half of what I want to say. Essentially a historical picture of the story of Benedictine education in England. But I think there is another story that is in the making. And I think if we look at the rule of St. Benedict, there are a number of really fundamental ideas which are central to any concept of education. And I would like just to flag these up in the minutes that remain to me. The rule of St. Benedict very begins, its opening words are articulated in terms of a relationship between teacher and pupil. Listen, my son, to the teachings of a master. And I think we've got 3 things involved there which are central to education. First of all, the importance, not just the value, the importance of teaching. Not encouraging people to learn or explore the world. Of course that's important too, but actual teaching. That's one thing. The next thing is obviously the challenge of learning through listening. And finally, the relationship between teacher and pupil. I think this is a really important thing. It's not simply about the values of community life. I mean, St. Benedict does talk about that, and I'll include them later on. But the relationship of teacher to pupil is a loving relationship, but an authority relationship. And I think that really touches the challenge in education, to ensure that authority is communicated as an invitation to a relationship which is supportive and recognized as loving in the sort of father-son sort of relationship, in which obedience comes naturally. So those, I think, are two values, teaching and listening. And I mean, I should say that in learning, listening is important, because if you can learn to listen to a teacher, you can learn to listen to all sorts of things. You can learn to listen to others, you learn to listen to yourself, you learn to listen to the world around you. And it's this listening, this passivity, which encourages us to be open and to respond actively to a world, not to try to impose ourselves on the world, to sort of dominate it, but to respond to it and to play our natural part in shaping it. A third rule which I think is important is, simply discipline. It obviously comes from the word to learn, but in order to learn, a pupil has to learn to value order and to learn to sort of keep things in order and tidy so that things can work efficiently. This obviously can be carried to an extreme, but I do think that learning, an important part of education is about learning one's own place in forming an ordered world, an ordered community. And part of that order, and I think this is perhaps more important still, is the reverence which comes from appreciating, through listening and finding your place in things, your place in an order. Reverence is our acknowledgement of that order. And reverence is where I would put the importance of honouring truth, of honouring other people, of practicing humility, and learning to recognise God's presence in everything. I think this is the fundamental, obviously, level of spiritual formation in Benedictine education. And of course, marks Benedictine education out from, or marks education out from really what is so prominent in the world today, which is the sort of gaudiness of vanity and pride, and the inability, the sort of loss of any respect for truth. If those are four rules which are about shaping the heart and the mind in education, there are other rules which are about developing our collaborative work in the development of communities. And I think one of the standard things which comes out in the rule is that it's full of welcome. Its hospitality is very important in the rule, but the patience and all the sorts of tact and generosity that actually being able to welcome other people into a school community involves. With that capacity to welcome, that openness, obviously there is a concern for the individual, and the hospitality which our Lord shows for the individual is through the recognition of everybody has got strengths and weaknesses, and it's the ability to try to meet people in their weakness, to sort of serve that so that they can be brought, as it were. I have the image of when you greet somebody who arrives for a meal. Obviously, you greet them, you recognise they may have, it may be cold, they may need the bathroom, they may need to they may have had an accident, they may need to sort of some first aid. But the point is, all that is part of a process in which you're trying to bring people into a group, where you introduce them to others, and eventually you can sit down at a table together and share the hospitality, the meal that you are, that the people have come for. I think this concern for the individual is obviously important, but it's, yeah. And in doing that, obviously, recognizing gifts, that people have weaknesses but also strengths. And if Christ doesn't turn anyone away, I'm sure he has a challenge for everyone. And I think monastic life certainly tries to use people's gifts, create scope for them to use their gifts, but the challenge will be to use them selflessly, to use them for other people's good, not for vainglory. As a result, I think one can hope that Benedictine education teaches people, and I think this is something which pupils recognize who come to our schools. They recognize the vibrancy and happiness of a genuine human community. Not without problems, obviously, but a community which can seek to address problems. And that community building is, I think, something which has to be part of a vision for our world today. We have to, I think we can offer through our schools and through any work that we do as Benedictine communities, the education of learning, the education of learning good order, the education of learning a reverence, the education of learning to acknowledge other people, the education of learning to work with people so that their needs are addressed, but their gifts are made really good use of, so that we can live together in patience, gentleness, forgiveness, mutual respect, and forbearance. I really do think that our world today is crying out for these sorts of community values. And I think the difficulty we have realizing this kind of society is because we have lost the context within which we can appreciate our own place in the world. And I hope that through education, either in schools or in any other way, our Benedictine communities can continue to promote that. I think that's where I will leave what I have to say for now. And I understand that there is a chance to deal with questions, and it was a little bit of extra time, perhaps no bad thing. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Father Foster, for this wonderful presentation on the history and tradition of English Benedictines in terms of education. And as the輔仁University itself was founded by the Benedictines in Beijing, from the US group, and even now we have 3 different religious and the diocesan clergy each together run this particular university. And as you mentioned about how the Benedictines has become a spiritual force in the school rather than really running a school. Here also we have the same sort of a situation where the religious communities are at the background as a spiritual force rather than really in front and running the school as such. So there are many places what you are talking about, the challenges. I think we can very much relate to that, even in Taiwan as a religious school, and it's very sort of inspiring as well as comforting to see that we all face the similar challenges as a religious.
Yes, indeed, you're right. It is encouraging.
So thank you for that, and let me open for anybody else got any questions or anything. 有没有什么想要问的问题？
So may I ask a question?
Yeah,
So,
sure.
Yeah. So, Father David, you have mentioned about the challenges, but I think most of Benedict who are teaching now, either at a school or at a university, have made the same challenges. And will you sometimes discuss about these challenges and possible strategy for that in your community? Or do you have any possible solution for that situation? Thank you.
Thank you. It depends a lot on, as it were, what the challenges are. I mean, one challenge is the sort of diminishing numbers of monks. I mean, I suppose in my experience, I've seen my own community becoming very, very small, and I think that has been very dispiriting. I think there was always the assumption that we would remain in charge. And so I think one of the challenges is do not be afraid to let go of power. Or put it another way, do not be afraid of letting go of control, because what's actually important is the authority of, as it were, the integrity of your own life. And I think it would have been for us a lot more helpful had we sort of concentrated more on being with, accompanying and supporting lay members of staff in undertaking the direction of the school, which we've obviously done in more recent years, than worrying about trying to keep things going, keep our hands on control. I think that's one issue about learning to collaborate and to trust the responsibility and capability of others, where you have assumed that it was your job. Another one, I think, as regards the abuse issues and everything, which I think is the critical thing, I think the one thing we've learned is it's absolutely crucial to acknowledge what's going on and to tell the truth, to deal with things with complete without any embarrassment, to deal with issues straight on. I think we've always, that critically, I think it's come up that it's always looked as though the religious authority, it may be a bishop, it may be a priest, it may be a school, the religious authority has tried to protect its own people rather than victims. This is obviously wrong, but I think it's also a slight misunderstanding of the embarrassment in which people found themselves. And I think it's not so much a question of, as it were, an abbot wanting to protect his own monk. It's been more a question of wanting to protect the institution rather than care for the individual. And I think that is this tension between a responsibility to the institution and a responsibility to the individual is really, a very difficult problem. But I think certainly in these issues of personal integrity, I think people have had to recognize how it is the individual that's far more important than the institution. I think the only other recommendation I'd have in terms of facing challenges is what matters is that God is at work, and I think above all we worry about our own inadequacies rather than how we can respond to the Spirit, and we don't, I think, perhaps allow ourselves to trust that to be imaginative and to understand that the Spirit can do something new. I think the difficulty is that when the Spirit is doing something new, it tends to work just as nature does, through a wintering before a spring. And I think we tend to notice the dying process more than the beginnings of spring. And I think we have to be prepared for that.
Thank you for answering, David.
Okay. I think first I just wanted to ask one final question before we wrap up. You mentioned that most of the numbers of the monks are dwindling, and then you have many lay people who are accompanying you in running your educational institutions. How do you? The one question is, how do you maintain that Benedictine spirituality within this system? The second question is, often we also face resistance from the students or the staff within our own institute towards this type of, because sometimes our own staff may be more secularized, and maybe there will be some sort of a resistance to these sort of values within our own curriculum or within our own educational system. So how do you face a similar challenge, or how do you deal with that?
I think this is the big question, which is sort of probably work in progress. I think one way in which, you do have to build up trust with obviously lay staff, and on the other hand, I think in England anyway, at least in my experience, lay staff who may be fairly unreligious, nevertheless are attracted to a Catholic school because it's got something to it which they can feel would be good for them. And I think the important point, is to work on that, the possibility that is there. I think that might even be a criterion for employment, but I think there is often something there that you can work with, and obviously encourage them to feel that they can contribute something, even though there's an awful lot that they will feel confused and embarrassed, perhaps awkward about. You can be sure that the staff are no different from the pupils, and that it's through creating a positive environment of learning and that I think you can overcome a lot of anxiety. I think one of the problems we found was that while the monks were really concerned about developing, as it were, good community relationships in the school, the staff want to teach. And they really want to understand how their authority as teachers can be sort of made part of this work. So I think that's another part, actually, to show that things that their concerns can be part of the Benedictine project. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. And I think we also find a similar way. Like here, we will find that, at least in our number-wise, the Protestant parents sometimes think about our Catholic university as a place for their children, because they think that this Catholic university can give them a spiritual foundation, even though they are not Catholics, but they think that this can give a Christian foundation for their own children. That's something.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there isn't such a, I mean, when dealing with young people, there isn't such a big difference between Catholic and non-Catholic.
Yeah. Okay, and thank you very much for that. I think we are almost on the. Thank you very much for David Foster for your sharing, and it's a pleasure to have you. And then thank you very much for that, and we'll find some other time to meet you in person. Thank you for that.
And Merry Christmas in advance.
Merry Christmas to you.
God bless you.
God bless. Bye. 好，那我们也谢谢司马院长替我们做的主持。好，那接下来我们还有最后一场，我们可以休息2分钟，然后请达卫神父来跟我们做最后一场演讲。